they maybe kind of look in some different places, and where you're not looking in the same places every year. So you kind of maybe you can see some differences. Now, what we also do is generally we're not trying to manage necessarily even just on 1 point estimate of a sex ratio. We know that there's annual variation. So really we're going to try to look at, if we're looking at sex ratios and Fondo ratios, we're looking at what's the 3-year average, and recognizing one, that there could maybe be some differences in observation from year to year, but there's also just trends from year to year do change. So to try to give us the best estimate possible, we're going to take that average. As far as kind of to validate the data, the best way to validate data is to have more data. So the more data we can get is the best. We also have to survive on a limited budget, which honestly has been decreasing over the years. So we've had maybe a little less flight time in some places over the years, but at the same time, I think we also try to evolve. We try to learn different things. When I first started on the Uncompahgre Plateau, I mentioned earlier that, like, for mule deer classification, we collect our sex and age ratios using quadrat estimates. And part of that's because we have this long-term monitoring study designed where we've got quadrats that are stratified across the plateau based on previous density estimates that we've done. So we're trying to incorporate the most science possible to get at these different values and data that we're collecting. Now, at the same time, so since we were doing deer separately from elk, we were just doing kind of ad hoc surveys. We were flying elk winter range to look for elk and get our bull cow ratios and calf cow ratios. Well, what we also are seeing, and we see in other places too, is that if from around anywhere in southwest Colorado, we have a lot of pinyon juniper. So sightability is pretty difficult, but we do know that bulls are hanging out disproportionately at times more in the PJ than maybe the cows and calves are actually staying up at higher elevations in the better quality habitat. So one of the things that we actually implemented was trying out, and we tried this across a 3-year period where we were still doing our ad hoc classification, and then we also went in and we developed a random point system where we mapped winter range, and we would identify points across the landscape. We'd go in, we'd fly those points for 10 minutes to get at our bull cow ratios, knowing that you'd always like to fly where all the elk are, but we know that bulls are down in places where you don't expect to see a lot of elk. So what that does, it kind of cuts down on the number of animals that we observed, but it actually also gives us a better estimate of our bull cow ratios. So it is an evolving science, and we're trying to always do the best we can. And new science, new literature out there, we're always willing to try different techniques to improve the data that we're collecting. Does that kind of get at hopefully what you're asking? I'd be happy to, if we can get some more information for you later, I'd be happy to do that as well.
Great, thank you, Brett. The gentleman in the audience want to come forward? If you just come up to the podium, we'll capture your voice on recording. If you wouldn't mind identifying yourself too.
I'm Brian Lewis, local resident here.
Welcome, Brian.
Yeah, my question is, he's been doing these surveys trying to count these animals, and in my belief, the elk in particular, have been decreasing in our corner of the state very rapidly, and I think something needs to be done before they fall off a cliff. And I'm asking him professionally if he agrees with me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think everybody is seeing that as well. Now, there's 2 aspects to it. Part of it, one of them has been by design. There has been an aspect where we had really high elk populations in the early 2000s. We had herd management plans that were directing us to reduce populations. So we did that. At least in this is, and I know in your area, I don't know this far south as well, but for instance, like the Uncompahgre Plateau in 2002, I think we were estimating we were at like 13,000 elk, and our objective was 9,500. So there has been that effort to reduce populations. Now, at the same time, and what I hear all the time and what we see too with our classification is our calf-cow ratios have been coming down. Now, one of the ideas that we thought was, okay, if this idea of density dependence and habitat is limiting calf recruitment, then as we reduce a population, calf-cow ratios should start to increase. And we haven't done that. Now, on the Uncompahgre, we were at, like I said, I think we were at 12,500 or almost around 13,000. Now we're at 8,500, and we're seeing exactly that. Is our calf-cow ratios have dropped down below 30 calves per 100 cows with the license allocation we were doing, and the population is definitely taking this nosedive. So now what are we doing? We're having to drastically reduce cow tags to try to address this. And then we also, in the state, like I mentioned earlier, we've started up this elk pilot study to try to get at better of what is affecting calf recruitment. We've seen some things actually hinting at pregnancy rates may not be the best. Last year on the Uncompahgre, with the first year of the pilot study, we estimated we were at, if I remember right, I think 78% pregnancy rate. This year with our, which does fall within the range of variability, but you'd still think for elk, it can definitely be higher, and it would be higher. This year with our helicopter captures, our pregnancy rates were at, I think, 97%. So now it's really going to be interesting to see what happens next year. Is it a factor of mild conditions this year? Last year we had a way above average snow up in the higher parts of the mountains, and then this year we had no snow, and we had no real rain last year on winter range. So I mean, habitat conditions weren't the best, but the animals were this year the elk were definitely staying higher, so they were maybe taking advantage of some good quality winter rain or forage over winter this year that they didn't do the year before. So yeah, I mean, we're trying, again, this is kind of the thing, we're trying to get as much information as we can as well, and it's kind of evolving and always trying to get any information. But I mean, that's where, as a biologist, and I know the district wildlife managers, the district wildlife managers interact with the public way more than I do as a biologist, but I'm always talking to people too. And, I always do appreciate hearing what people are observing on the ground, because, yeah, I mean, it helps us to identify if there's some other questions we need to be asking or be answering, and how to answer them better.
Thanks, Brett. Commissioners, any comments or questions? Oh, Commissioner
Not a
Bray.
question, just a comment, Brad, this was fantastic. I really look forward to chapter 2 and 3, but this was really good. We've asked for this kind of information for a long time. It really helps us understand just exactly. We may agree or disagree with the numbers and the classifications, but at least this is a fantastic observation of how you go about it. Good job.
Thank you.
Just in response also to the public, Commissioner Bray, could I ask you to summarize what we did in the last meeting, kind of relative to this and the studies that are being undertaken? I mean, we did.
Yes, we, as Brad, you know, Commissioner Vigil and I pushed for increased studies and expansion of your current study going on, and we want to expedite it, and we'll provide the funding to get it done. And totally understand in Mr. Vestig's esteemed experience that we got to follow the rules and follow the protocol, but we want to push this as hard as we can, and let's get some answers before we fall off that cliff. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Commissioner Zimmerman?
Commissioner Zimmerman.
I just had one question on slides 23 and 24, the pie chart that I know Commissioner Peisel loves because we love graphs. I can see. So I think it may be because it's December through June, but I'm just curious what slice of the pie is harvest?
So I mean, there's a little bit that falls into harvest, but really with the monitoring studies, part of it is on the Uncompahgre. We don't have doe licenses. So really harvest isn't a factor. We did have doe licenses, I think, for 3 years on the Uncompahgre Plateau. So that's where there's a little piece of the pie, I think, on for does, but that is why it's really small. But at the same time, when we're collecting this information, we're on the monitoring studies, we're actually taking out, if there is any hunter harvest, we don't include that in this estimate because that'll actually come, we'll include it in discussion and presentation, but when we actually put that into the population model, we don't include that part of the harvest because we already have our harvest estimates as well. So otherwise we'd be taking out double the amount of harvest.
Any other questions or comments? Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next is Mr. DeWalt again. If you don't mind, thanks.
Good afternoon again. Reed DeWald, Assistant Director of Wildlife and Natural Resources. This next agenda topic is a continuation of a discussion we had in May during Andy Holland's license setting presentation. Towards the end of that, we started a discussion about how the commission may be able to see license numbers a little earlier or in a different manner than on that commission meeting in May, and then having to approve it at that same meeting. And really, I think the intent of that was to give the public a little bit more time to look at those numbers and to just have more discussions and maybe make recommendations for changes and things like that. So that's the intent of this brief agenda topic, is just to discuss a possible path forward and then hopefully close that discussion. We didn't really have time or the right people there to finish that discussion. So just a couple things in the background of where we're at and how we got here, I guess, and some of it's in the presentation that Brad just gave. But when we look at our license setting process and how we manage our big game animals, we really focus on those herd management plans. Commissioner Bray at the last meeting said that's one of the most important things that we do as an agency and you guys do as a commission. And we truly believe that. And there's tons of work that go into those herd management plans. You'll see two here this afternoon. Craig McLaughlin will present two for finalization as well. But those herd management plans are really the basis of what we do. We set our population objectives there and our sex ratio objectives. And so everything we do as far as license setting is set in those herd management plans, really. So the discussions about licenses and increases and decreases at that meeting in May, where you traditionally see it, is overshadowed or driven by the herd management plan. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as we have this discussion. Brad mentioned it as well, but throughout the year, numerous members of our staff are collecting input from the public on the herds, what people are seeing and experiencing on the ground, and we continue to make observations and collect that data throughout the year. We know that our hunters are very interested in their particular GMU. Maybe it's where they live or where they hunt or do other activities, and so they have this local knowledge and local desire to be involved with that specific hunt code usually. But as we roll it up across the state, we have over 3,000 hunt codes that we present to you in that meeting for finalization. So it's really difficult to pull out the few that may have concerns or controversy or whatever it may be. And so we're looking for a way forward to have that discussion with the public and yet not have all 3,000 hunt codes brought forward and we can micromanage those to death. That's why we really focus on those herd management plans. That's where that direction is given. Our population models rely on that total estimated harvest that Brad was talking about as well. And the collection of that harvest information is dependent on the timing of our hunting seasons and the time required to complete those 75,000 plus hunter surveys. And so that's what's driving the timing of when you all can see the numbers or when we get the numbers to you and complete our process for setting licenses. We notice that more and more of our seasons are running later into January and even February now. Traditionally, in the past, those seasons haven't occurred like that, but we notice there's more special seasons that are in that January timeframe. So the collection of that harvest information is starting to be delayed even more, which then delays when we get that license setting and modeling completed. And the last point I'll make before moving on to some of the options is when you all see that huge spreadsheet that you saw, and I'm sure you love to look at that thing, that represents literally thousands and thousands of hours of staff time, whether it's biologists collecting data, as you've just seen from aircraft, to public input processes in the HMPs, and it affects almost every section in our agency, and so there's just a lot that goes into that, and so those are just some things to keep in mind as we consider maybe a two-step process for license setting, or expanding the one-step process, or timing, or things like that. And I don't want to be pre-decisional in any of that discussion, but those are just things to think about. Our current timeline, and Brad talked about this a little bit as well. His presentation was certainly timely with mine. Through the December through February timeframe, that's when we're out there collecting that data. Biologists and DWMs are in the aircraft, or doing other data collection, and that's really the time frame. December through February is when we collect that data. February through March is when we are transcribing the data, getting it off those voice recorders, those hours and hours of data there. We're entering that data into our population models, and then each area in the state has an annual license setting meeting as well, where the DWMs and biologists sit down and come up with their draft license recommendations. In April, we spend time aligning those license recommendations with our hunt codes and our regulations, and then we create that summary document. And that's when we actually have a statewide license meeting, our regulation review, where all our regulation managers, our senior biologists and our regional managers and those type of folks meet, and we come to agreement on those the statewide licenses. And that's when we create that report that is given to you. And so in May is when the commission approves those license recommendations, and then we run those primary draws and start the process of awarding the licenses. So that's just some of the time frame of what we're dealing with. And so I know at the last meeting there were some requests to look at just several options, maybe being able to get those draft license recommendations to the public sooner, and that will be in my proposal going forward. Maybe looking at a two-step process for license recommendation. There was talk of maybe an April meeting and then a May finalization, and that we can talk about that as well. And then there's some other options we can look at, but those are really the two that were discussed. So before I go any further, any questions on anything I said or comments before I move forward with what my recommendation would be for next year and then the following years? Okay, so I asked my staff to look at the process going forward and what may be preferred option. We will set those draft regulations in our April regulation review. And then typically, this is our typical process now, and what was observed this year is about 10 days before the commission meeting, the public sees those on the website and can start to look at those. What I would propose for next year is that as soon after that regulation review meeting, that we post those draft license recommendations on the website for next year. And what that would mean is that the public would need to know those are draft and that they're subject to change. The ones they saw this year are more in a final status. So we could post draft recommendations probably about 2 weeks earlier than we did before, like this year. And
Reed,
then
Reed, what does that mean? What date?
It all depends on your May commission meeting. So I would assume probably April, do you have an idea, Jeff? 15th through 20th, somewhere in there? That's a rough guess, but it would be probably 2 weeks earlier than what they were posted this year. We'd have to tie that down a little bit just with the May commission meeting. That's what sets our regulation review on the license setting. So, but it would be about 2 weeks earlier. So, and then what we would do is post those, and then what I would propose is that we have a notice call with all of you and then any interested members of the public where we can look at those license numbers on the phone. I know we did it with another topic this year, and maybe just open it up that way as well, and so that you all can receive comments on the draft recommendations, and then we can discuss those there, and then maybe make changes before we see a more final version at the May meeting and that, because you vote at the May meeting, and basically things begin right when you vote. People are in Denver listening and are ready to go. There's a couple things we can do to help the process as well. I know that when you see that large spreadsheet with the 3,000 hunt codes, it's somewhat overwhelming. It is when it shows up on my desk as well. And typically less than probably 5% of our hunt codes change year to year. And so we could bring those hunt codes and draw them out so that you don't have to look at all the hunt codes at once. That would really direct our conversation to the ones that are changing. Another option would be to look at only really look at the ones that are above or below our herd management plan objectives. And so that if they were inside the herd management plan, we wouldn't really have to discuss those. We would more manage that at the herd management plan level. So those are some options going forward. I do have some other options that aren't really ready for prime time, but that we're discussing throughout the year. And what I'd like to do is have that discussion throughout the year with my staff, and then bring a couple of those options forward to you. And that might create a two-step process going forward, but there could be some dramatic changes, and we just want to be careful with that discussion before we bring it to all of you, so that we thoroughly vet it with the commission. But we just want to make sure that we're meeting your needs, getting those license numbers to you.
Commissioner Vehil.
Thank you, Reed. I think any change you make that changes the timing would be a huge improvement. I made the comment last meeting when those were in front of us. What happens if we don't approve them? Well, that was a little bit facetiously, but it's
You got
true.
some people's attention with that comment. I'll say.
I'm sure. I'm sure there are a few people like Chick Corey that just about died, but that's the case.
Right.
We need them before, and even if it's 2 weeks that we talk about those that are major changes, that gives the commission some time and the public to actually look at those things before we have no choice but to approve it, like
Sure.
in the past.
And that's really my intent as well, is not to put you all in that situation where you don't have an option. We want you to have some options, and we definitely want the public to have that option as well, to enter that discussion with those draft numbers, and do it before we're here in front of all of you, and maybe in a little bit more informal manner.
Commissioner Bray.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thanks, Reed. I think this is a great improvement, and look forward to ideas. I know we can't analyze all 3,000, but if the changes are, and particularly the trends, particularly in any one area or any one particular unit, we can lump some areas together, I think, and get a general idea. And I know it's not popular to in the essence of time, I mean, we can tweak, maybe we can move our May meeting one more week or something. I don't know. I know putting the draw back a few days may or may not be palatable to the public, but at least those are options we might ought to consider in the so we can be more transparent with our.
And I know you all haven't finalized dates for the commission meetings yet for next year, but I do believe we're looking at that as well for the May meeting, is having it possibly a week later than it was this year.
Commissioner Peisel.
Thanks so much, Reed, and thanks for making the effort to make this easier for us to do. It's like the budget and the visuals. And before we had these spreadsheets that nobody could understand. And if, there's 3,000 units or plans, but there are a lot that don't have issues or are doing pretty well. But then there are, like in my area, there are those that do have problems or issues or concerns, and so a way to flag those or bring those to our attention, so that we know that we need to look at those and keep them on the radar for us. So yeah, the visual, the chart, yeah, this is where it was, but this is where it is now.
Right, and we're looking at ways to improve, much like Justin did with the financial information, improve how you all see that information, make it just easier to digest. Another thing I forgot to mention is if we are having an area with a severe winter or some other natural event that's going on that's going to really affect our herds, we can bring some of that information to all of you in March. I mean, we observe it on the ground, and we can have some preliminary discussions even before some of the license settings. Say, look, we're having some issues in this area, and we could really start looking at that in March as well. Those are rare, but we could have those discussions earlier as well. So.
I had a question, Reed. Is the April call that you talked about, that's kind of responsive to our suggestion of a workshop, that idea?
Right, and that just comes out of an efficiency and effectiveness look instead of a meeting where we all travel, that maybe we could do a webinar or a call or something like that where we could have that discussion through technology instead of all gathering in one place. But if we want to gather, we could do that. I wouldn't do it maybe as a commission meeting, just because of the size of a commission meeting, but we could do something more informal. So.
I think the call is great. I think our concept was commissioners that, those of us that are, for example, a sportsman's rep like myself could opt into a workshop type environment. So I don't know if others, commissioners would want to get together, but I'd be fine with that myself. Thank you much.
I don't need company. So.
Okay, and this wasn't necessarily an action. I just wanted to get a general feel for the commission, and if that seems to satisfy, we'll go that route and then continue to look at other options to improve the process the following year.
I apologize, Commissioner Vito.
I really appreciate you taking a look at this and coming back with something that is going to benefit not only the commission, because we're the least
Careful.
of the group, but I mean, it's the public that we need to serve. If we can do this by serving them better, it's a good thing.
And even you folks, I mean, even the staff, if we can, identify, or if there are problem areas, if it's in a form that you guys can keep track of it and see how it's, maybe you do, but maybe if it's in an easier form to identify those areas that are having issues, and you can track whether you're improving or not improving or making progress.
Sure.
Just for the record, that's Commissioner Pizell speaking.
Sorry again, Chairman, I do that.
You can do it either way. Thank you, Reed.
Okay, thank you all.
Commissioners, we're scheduled for a 15-minute break. My watch tells me it's 3:19, and if we could gather back at 3:25, I'd be grateful. Thanks.
Zippy, zippy.
you.